our congregation, and for those that don't know me, I'm Pastor Bertha Nestande of the Bethlehem Lutheran Church. Today is a very special day. It's Decoration Day, when we remember all those who recently fought for our country. The official ceremony is a little bit later, up on Coffee Street. But at this time, our hearts and our minds turn to the most recent war and all the pain that it brought. Now, what we have not done as a congregation is to speak about this war in the land of our forefathers, in Norway. Many of us still have relatives there, and they have written to us. It is time to share those stories, and we share the Lutheran religion with them as well. Today we are very privileged to have as our guest speaker Mary Osgard Hinderlie. Yes. Mary is the daughter of our Bishop Osgard, the head of the National Evangelical Church. Now the bishop has graced our town and Bertha and my home with visits in the past. In fact, he's even stayed overnight at our home, and I dare to call him a good friend. Now, just before the war started, the Crown Prince and Princess from Norway came to America and toured many Norwegian communities, including our very own town. Now, that tour proved very beneficial because the bishop, Osgard, and all the churches across the country raised $28 million to go to the war effort in Norway. Yes. It's an amazing sum of money, and for that we all can be proud. The money went for weapons and equipment for the Norwegian resistance fighters, but just as important, it went for food and clothing for the Norwegian families that were hurting due to the Nazi occupation. Now, the occupation began in 1940 when the German army marched into Norway through a neutral Sweden, and Sweden put up no defense. Now, I know it's easy to be resentful, but our Norwegian relatives would not give up. They fought hard for 2 months, and then they went underground. The resistance then sabotaged railways and supplies for the German army any way they could. Far north in Narvik, there was a battle to destroy German ships and the railroad lines that brought the Swedish iron ore across Norway to be loaded onto those ships to go back to Germany to make weapons. We sabotaged, our Norwegian relatives sabotaged, the heavy water plants that Hitler wanted to make the bomb, and they succeeded in preventing him from doing that. They sabotaged any way they could to put up against the Nazis, and they often paid the price for their valor in imprisonment or death. The resistance was led by the Crown Prince Olaf and King Håkon, who went underground into London. In fact, the head bishop of Norway, Bishop Berggrav, was captured fighting with the resistance fighters, and he was put into exile in solo confinement in the woods. But he escaped in disguise and went back and continued fighting for the resistance. Let's hear it for the Norwegian resistance fighters. Now we have learned of a song and a poem that's been proudly sung in Norway over the past 3 years. Some call it Prince Olav's anthem. We'd like to share it with you. The title is Norway in red, white, and blue, or Norge i rød, hvit og blå. I'd like to share a few lines with you first, in English. And the birches are whiter than winter, and the midnight sun turns the sky red. And the blue is the blue waves, the ocean. It is Norway, it's Norway, indeed. And now, please welcome to the podium, Mary Oscar Hinderlie.
Thank you, Pastor. Welcome, everybody. I am so pleased that you are here to hear the stories that have happened across the ocean with our ancestors, children, and all of our cousins who live there. My husband, Pastor Carolyn and I went over to Oslo to go to university in 1939. You may wonder why we did such a thing. We knew that Europe was in terrible danger. There were dark days, but no one ever thought that Hitler and his armies would ever invade a little country like Norway that was neutral. Well, invade they did in 1940. We had had a lovely year. Suddenly, there were the Navy, Norwegian Navy, that is, was fighting in Oslo Harbor against the Germans. They sunk the ship, they won that battle. This allowed the royalty and the government to escape to Sweden and to Tromsø, northern Norway. There was bombing on the west coast of ships belonging to Norway. There was the Battle of Narvik that the good pastor just finished telling you about. That lasted almost 2 months long, aided by the British Army, we believe. So, we were very fortunate, I tell you now, that the United States was not in the war yet. We were still neutral. We were allowed to leave. We crossed down to Denmark, which was occupied. We took the railroad through Denmark, through Hitler's Germany, through Mussolini's Italy, where we took a ship to New York City, and a train to Minneapolis, where our parents greeted us and were they relieved. You can only imagine. We were worried. My husband, Carol, and I were so worried about our friends back in Norway. They were totally vulnerable to the German army. Fortunately, my father, the bishop, sprang into action and began raising money to support the Norwegian resistance, as you heard earlier. That made us feel a bit better.
Yes, and he raised a great deal of money, and that was so helpful. And then you had an adventure in the Pacific. Tell us about that.
Well, adventures make great stories, but I would never wish this one on any of you. After our experience with war-torn Europe, my husband and I, the pastor, decided to go to be missionaries in China. Now, understand that China at this time was under a great famine, very impoverished, occupied by the Japanese, who were killing civilians in large numbers. And and we wanted to help. We got on a boat. They would not let us in at Hong Kong. So we went to the Philippines. There we set up our camp of missionaries where we learned how to speak Mandarin and plan how we would proceed once we finally could go into China. We had a lovely year. We were up in a tiny village in the mountains near the Corregidor region. It was a little town called Baguio, and Baguio was beautiful. However, after a year, Pearl Harbor came. The same day Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Philippines were bombed. You could hear the bombs gradually getting closer. We would dive under tables and chairs and beds whenever the siren went off, but I was in the hospital. I had just had a baby 7 days before this. So I left the hospital and we got as safe as we could with my 7-year-old baby. And as we heard them approaching, finally, after 3 weeks, the Japanese occupied the Philippines. We were all rounded up with the townspeople and all of our missionaries and taken further up the mountain to a concentration camp that had been built just for us. We became prisoners of war. My daughter spent the first 3 years of her life in a prisoner of war camp. Poor little Marn. She survived. You know, there was not enough food. It was difficult to stay clean, and put those together and you have a lot of illness. Fortunately, Marn did not get one of the terrible illnesses. Time went on and on and on, and we kept hoping and waiting to be rescued, and it didn't happen. We would try to lift our spirits by gathering as many people as the guards would allow in order to sing hymns and to pray. And that really did lift everyone's spirits. Do you know what most lifted our spirits? It was the babies and the toddlers. The little ones have a power to let us think good thoughts about the future and worry less about the present. And you know, everybody felt that. People began making little toys for the children out of rags and sticks and rocks and charcoal drawings. And you know, the children were quite happy. We told them a lot of stories. Children don't know the difference. We did, and we had to struggle to keep a positive attitude for our children. I think we did all right. After 3 years, we heard bombing in the distance, the far distance. We knew it had to be the Allies, the Americans. Gradually, it got closer. Day after day, week after week, it got closer, and we got more and more hopeful until when it sounded quite close, we were all rounded up. We were marched down the mountain, round the island, and into Manila and the Bilibid prison, which is far worse than where we had been. There we sat for 2 months, waiting for the complete reoccupation by the Allies. And then finally, one day, through the gates of the camp, in came the Americans, and you know, one of them yelled out, "Is there anyone there from Minnesota?" I will never forget the joy we felt at that moment. And of course, we came home, and we are happy and healthy, fortunately, although we did lose a few people. Now, every night, I would tell my little Mark a quote, my favorite quote from from Robert Louis Stevenson. The world is so full of a number of things that we shall all be as happy as kings. And I think she listened, because now, when she's drifting off to sleep at night, she says, Mama, we have everything. We have everything. And we do, and I think you do too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We're so glad you're home safe from the war.
Pastor, I have a story to share.
Oh, Paul, come up here, Paul. Everybody, this is Paul Abrahamson, and I think most of you know Paul was a prisoner of war in Germany.
Yes, indeed, I was. But something you may not have known was that speaking Norwegian on my little family farm right outside of Lanesboro may have just saved my life in prison. You see, when I first got to prison, the German guards would never take their eyes off me, not for 1 second, day in, day out. I was confused. I didn't see a reason why they were keeping such close eyes on me all the time. Eventually, I met a Norwegian resistance fighter, and we spoke Norwegian to have some privacy. After that, the guards just stopped. One of the other Norwegian resistance fighters overheard them saying that my name Abrahamson had sounded Jewish, and that's why they were focusing. That same resistance fighter also told me the story of the town of Narvik bombing, and how he'd helped his family flee. You see, when Narvik was being bombed, he was helping his family to escape to a little sea cave in the harbor, but the harbor was full of mines. They spent the night navigating carefully through the harbor, and eventually they made it safely. But unfortunately, he was later captured 3 weeks later, sending radio messages to help other Norwegian resistance fighters.
Thank you, Paul. These are important stories for us to remember. Oh, Mrs. Brekke.
Thank you, Pastor. I'm Mrs. Brekke, and this story was told to me by my relatives in Norway. My cousin was hiding in a basement with Norwegian resistance fighters when it was bombed by the Germans, and many people were buried in the rubble. He survived, but he was injured. He still has terrible headaches from the injuries that he suffered in that bombing. His children had a Russian prisoner of war camp right behind their school. And the children could see that the Russian soldiers were hungry. So they would save part of their lunch every day, and they would pass it through the barbed wire fence to the prisoners so that they wouldn't be so hungry. After the war, the Russians didn't want to go back to Russia because of Stalin. They had learned during their imprisonment, they learned more about the West and the advantages of living in the West, which Stalin had tried to hide from them. They told us that when they got back to Russia, that they would write to us if they survived, and we never got any letters or communication from them. So it's likely that they were sent to Siberia because they knew too much about the freedoms and life in the West.
Thank you, Pastor. Oh, such horrific stories about the war. By the way, I'm Mrs. Ruth Holthe, and on a lighter note, do you remember when the Crown Prince and Princess of Norway came to visit in the United States? Good. I was one of those asked to present the prince's flowers because they even came to our little tiny town of Lanesboro. And upon hearing that, I was so nervous. My hands started to shake. And I was sure I would dump those flowers right on the ground. Later on today, we'll be recreating that memorable event. So my advice to you is, don't miss it.
Now, the stories that we are hearing today remind us all how peaceful and calm our lives were here back in America during the war. I want everybody to be aware of all the refugees wandering Europe right now, millions of them with no home, very little food. Perhaps you've seen the newsreels of the friendship train we American citizens just sent to France. It was filled with food and clothing from every state. Now the Norwegians, most of them have their homes, but they have very little food. That has to be our next mission. We must raise money to help those that have helped to live through this war. We need to help God help others. Mrs. Nestande, would you play some inspiring music? People, I'm going to take you around town. There's other folks with war tales to tell, and I will take you to the next place. So please.